Hello everyone and welcome to Scary Stories. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I would love if you could leave a comment, letting me know from where you are listening around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you are enjoying the video. Thank you. When I was a kid, I never really thought much about the stories my dad used to tell and how protective he was when it comes to our whereabouts. He'd always mention how growing up, his childhood home was surrounded by strange occurrences, footsteps when no one was there, lights flickering and the feeling of being watched. But I never understood why he was so protective of us, why he would always check the locks twice or walk us to the car whenever we were going out. It wasn't until I was older that I learned the real reason why. My dad's childhood best friend had disappeared when they were young, vanished without a trace. It turned out years later that his friend had been another victim of the same man who later became infamous as the Golden State Killer. That's when I started to understand the fear that shaped my dad's every move. He believed that whoever took his friend was still out there watching. One summer night, when I was around 6 years old, my parents had gone out for a dinner party, and my older sister was at a friend's house. I was left alone at home, sitting on the couch with my dog Daisy, who was a golden retriever. It was one of those nights where everything felt too quiet, the kind of stillness that you can't ignore. I was in the living room watching cartoons when I noticed something strange. There was a large window in the living room that looked out onto the street. It was dark outside, and the only light came from the street lamp. I glanced at the window and saw a shadow move across it. It wasn't the usual shadows from trees or cars passing by. This was different. The shadow didn't move like something natural. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was standing just outside watching me. I froze. My heart started to pound, and Daisy usually is calm, but this time she started to whimper beside me. Her ears perked. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light maybe. But then I saw it again. A figure standing right outside, barely visible in the reflection on the glass. A tall man just standing there staring in the window. I slowly got up and tiptoed over to the window, trying not to make a sound. The moment I peeked outside, I couldn't see anymore, but my stomach twisted with a bad feeling I couldn't shake. I closed the blinds and sat down, trying to convince myself I was paranoid, but the feeling didn't go away. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, listening to every creak of the house. Daisy was still alert, her body tense as she stared at the door. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping noise coming from the back porch. The sound of something, or someone, moving against the glass. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. Then I heard a faint whisper, just loud enough to make my blood run cold. "Let me in." It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a deep and gravelly, like somebody trying to keep their voice low so no one would hear. My mind raced. Should I call my parents? No, I couldn't. The phone was upstairs and I was too scared to move. The scraping continued slowly, as if the person trying to find a way inside. Then I heard the back door handle jingle. It was the worst sound I've ever heard in my life. I immediately jumped up and ran to the hallway, shouting for Daisy to follow me. I slammed the door of my room and locked it, pressing my back against the door as I held my breath. I stayed like that for a while, barely making a sound. The scraping stopped, but I could still hear someone breathing on the other side of the door. I thought I was going to pass out from fear. Eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps walking away, slowly and carefully, as if the person was making sure I can't hear. I waited until I was absolutely certain the coast was clear before running to grab my phone. I called my parents and told them everything. They came home immediately and called the police. The officer who arrived told us they'd checked the area, but there was no sign of anyone. The strangest part was, the next morning, I went outside to check the porch. There were muddy footprints leading to the door, but nothing more. It was like the person had vanished into thin air. Over the years, I learned that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. My dad had mentioned that, before we moved into this house, there had been a series of break-ins in the area. Nothing was ever stolen, just signs of someone trying to get in. It made me wonder if the man was still out there watching and wanting to catch another person. I haven't lived in that house for years, but every now and then when I pass by it, I can't help but feel like someone is still watching me from behind the window. The memory of the whisper still haunts me. Sometimes, I wonder if the man ever really left, or it is my dad who was always afraid. Some things are just meant to stay hidden in the shadows. As I got older, the unsettling experience didn't stop. They just became quieter, At least that's what I thought. I moved to a new city for college and lived in a small apartment downtown, away from the childhood home. But every time I came back to visit my parents, something about the house always felt strange and scary, like it was holding on to something that it didn't want to let go. A few years after I graduated, one evening I went to my old neighborhood to grab dinner with a couple of friends. As we passed by my old house, I noticed that it looked different, darker somehow, even though it was only 6 p.m. The lights inside seemed dimmer, and the window by the porch, the very one I'd stared through all those years ago, was now covered with heavy blinds. Without really thinking, I pulled over and told my friends to wait in the car. I was drawn to the house like a magnet, my feet moving on their own toward the front door. I stood there for a moment staring at the house. The porch was still there, though the furniture was gone and the yard had become overgrown with weeds. But what struck me the most was the silence. There was no sound coming from inside, no life. Suddenly, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up like I was with some imaginary scary figure. I turned and saw a figure standing at the edge of the driveway, just barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat as I froze. Unsure whether I was seeing things right, the figure didn't move, just stood there watching me with a posture that seemed unnaturally still, almost like it had been waiting for me to show up. I didn't breath. My legs felt like they were made of heavy iron metal, but somehow I managed to force myself to walk back to the car. I slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. The figure remained there unmoving, as if it knew I was watching. My friends were confused by my sudden rush to leave, but they didn't press it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The mirror was gone. I haven't been back to that house since. It's funny how the mind works, how it can convince you that something is just your imagination, just a bad feeling that will fade with time. But that evening as I drove away, I knew deep down that something was still in that house. I knew that whatever it wasn't just watching from the shadows. It was waiting. Waiting for me to come back, just like it had waited years ago. And for me, that was the last time I stood in front of that window. And maybe that's why, every now and then when I lie awake at night, I can't help but wonder, how many people like me have lived in that house? How many people have left feeling like they were being followed but never understood why? And will I ever be free of the shadow in the window?